The Silent Killer. Part 1. A new case. After many years of quiet retirement, Detective James was living a peaceful life. He spent his days reading old books, taking long walks, and enjoying the calmness of being away from the chaos of his old job. He had solved many difficult cases when he was working, cases that no one else could crack. His reputation as one of the best detectives had spread far and wide. One day, while James was sitting by the window, enjoying a cup of tea, the phone rang. He didn't expect to hear from anyone, especially not about a new case. He picked up the phone slowly, his mind still focused on the peaceful routine he had come to love. "Detective James?" a voice asked. "Yes," James replied, his voice calm. "This is Officer Morgan from the City Police Department. We need your help, sir. We have a new case that, well, it seems very familiar to you." James sat up straight, suddenly alert. "Familiar? What do you mean?" "The murders, sir. The way they've been happening. It's just like the case you solved many years ago. We're hoping you can come out of retirement and take a look." James felt a mix of emotions. He hadn't thought about his old cases in a long time. The case that Morgan was referring to was one of the most difficult he had ever worked on. It had been solved, but not without a cost. The killer was never caught, and the memories of the case still haunted him. "I'm sorry, I'm retired now," James said. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this phone call was important. Something was telling him that he couldn't ignore it. "I understand, sir," Officer Morgan said, "but we don't know what to do. The killings, they're happening in the same way. Same methods, same patterns. We've looked through your old files, and it's like the same killer is back. Please, detective, we need your help." James paused, thinking deeply. He didn't want to go back to the life of danger and stress that came with being a detective. But something about the case felt different. It felt like it was calling him back. "I'll be there," James finally said. As soon as he agreed, Officer Morgan gave him the details. The first murder had taken place just outside the city, in a quiet neighborhood. The second one was only a few days ago, and the third just that morning. All the victims had been killed in the same way, and all the evidence pointed to a familiar pattern. James knew the old case well. He had solved it years ago, but the killer had never been caught. The strange thing was that no one ever figured out how the killer had managed to stay hidden for so long. The killer had left no trace, no fingerprints, no clues. It was as if the killer knew how to cover their tracks, how to stay out of sight. The phone call had come too suddenly, but James knew he had to go. As he hung up the phone, he grabbed his old coat from the closet. It had been years since he had worn it, but it still felt like a part of him. He walked out the door, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing. This case was not going to be easy. When he arrived at the police station, Officer Morgan was waiting for him. She looked relieved to see him, but there was also a hint of fear in her eyes. She led him to a small room in the back, where the police had set up their investigation. The victims were all found in different parts of the city, Officer Morgan explained. But there's one thing that links them. They all have one thing in common: the way they were killed. James studied the photos of the crime scenes carefully. He had seen these kinds of murders before. The method, the way the killer struck, it was all too familiar. It was the same as the case from years ago. "This is it," James murmured to himself. "The same killer. But how is that possible?" The case was closed. "We thought it was over." Officer Morgan looked at him, her face full of questions. "You think this is the same person? After all these years?" "I don't know," James said slowly. "But I need to find out." As the day went on, James reviewed all the files related to the case. The more he read, the more he realized how similar the new murders were to the ones he had investigated long ago. He could almost hear the killer's footsteps in the background, watching, waiting. But who was this killer? Why had they returned after so many years? Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the murders that bothered him. It was the feeling that the killer was watching him, too. It was as if they knew he was back, and they were waiting for him to figure it out. James couldn't shake that feeling, and as the day turned into night, he found himself standing alone in the dark, looking out of the window. Somewhere out there, the killer was waiting, and James was determined to find them before it was too late. Part 2. The Old Case returns. Detective James couldn't stop thinking about the phone call. He had agreed to return to work after so many years, but something about the case felt off. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger with every passing hour. He had faced dangerous criminals before, but this felt different. This time it was personal. The next morning, James met Officer Morgan at the crime scene of the latest murder. It was in a quiet neighborhood, just like the others. The streets were calm, but the air was filled with tension. The police had already set up a perimeter, and a few officers were standing guard. "Good morning, sir." Morgan greeted him with a nod. James nodded back. "Let's see what we're dealing with." They walked together to the scene of the murder, where a small group of officers were standing near a house. The door was open, and the lights were on inside. The house was quiet, but there was something chilling about the place. James could feel the weight of the situation. It was as though the killer was still there, hiding somewhere close. "Who found the body?" James asked. "A neighbor," Morgan answered. "She was out for a walk and saw something strange through the window. She called the police right away." They stepped inside the house, and James immediately noticed the eerie silence. It wasn't a loud crime scene, full of police shouting orders and rushing around. It was the opposite. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the killer had left without a trace. Once again. The victim was a middle-aged man, lying on the floor in the living room. He had been killed in the same way as the other victims. A single, clean cut to the throat. There was no sign of struggle. The man had simply been taken by surprise, without a chance to fight back. James knelt beside the body, his eyes scanning the room. He knew this type of murder well. It was quick and clean, done with precision. Whoever the killer was, they knew exactly what they were doing. There were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no clues to help them understand how the killer had gotten in. James stood up slowly, thinking. It was as if the killer had planned every step, covering their tracks so perfectly that no one could see where they had been. This is just like the old case, James murmured to himself. The same method, the same calmness. Morgan looked at him. You're saying it's the same person? I don't know, James replied, still staring at the body. But it feels like it. The way the killer acts. It's too familiar. They spent the next few hours gathering evidence, but nothing new came up. The victim's name was Peter Collins. He had no known enemies, and there was nothing unusual about his life. It was like he had been chosen randomly by the killer. As James walked through the house, his mind kept going back to his old case. The unsolved one. He had worked on it for years, but the killer had never been caught. James had been so close to solving it, but one small mistake had cost him everything. The killer had slipped away, vanishing without a trace. Now, decades later, the same thing was happening again. The same patterns, the same method, the same feeling of being watched. Sir, there's something you should see, one of the officers called out to James. He turned to find a young officer holding a small piece of paper. It was old and yellowed, as if it had been hidden for a long time. The officer handed it to James, who unfolded it carefully. It was a note, written in neat handwriting. The words were simple, but the message was chilling. I'm still here. James felt a shiver run down his back. The note was a message from the killer, left at the scene of the murder. It was almost as if the killer was mocking them, letting them know that they had returned. This is the same, James whispered. The same as before. Morgan looked confused. What do you mean, sir? James looked up at her, his face serious. The killer left notes back then too. Little messages, taunting me. It's like they were playing a game. And now they're doing it again. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. We need to find out more about Peter Collins. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he was targeted for a reason. As James and Morgan left the crime scene, the weight of the situation grew heavier. James was beginning to feel the pressure. The killer had returned after all these years. And this time, they were not just playing a game. They were watching James too. The next few days were a blur of interviews, evidence gathering, and trying to piece together the puzzle. James spent hours looking through old case files, trying to find any connection between the current murders and the cold case he had worked on years ago. But nothing seemed to fit. The new murders were so similar, but they didn't provide any answers. It was like the killer was one step ahead of him, always just out of reach. Then, On the fourth day after the murder, something happened that made James stop in his tracks. He received a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it sent a cold shiver through him. "It's been a long time, James," the voice said, calm and steady. James recognized it immediately. It was a voice he had hoped never to hear again. "You," James said quietly, his heart racing. "You're still out there." "Yes, I am," the voice replied. "And you're still trying to catch me. But you won't, James. You never did before, and you won't now." James gripped the phone tighter. "Why now? Why after all these years?" The voice chuckled softly. "Because it's time for you to remember. Time for you to realize what you missed all those years ago." The line went dead. James stood there, frozen, holding the phone. He knew this was just the beginning. The killer wasn't done yet. As he looked out the window, James felt the old fear return. This wasn't just another case. It was personal. The killer wasn't just trying to get away with murder. They were trying to make James pay for something from the past. Part 3. The Dark Past. Detective James couldn't shake the voice from his mind. It was like a haunting whisper, creeping into his thoughts at every turn. The killer had called him directly, something that hadn't happened before in any of his past cases. Whoever this person was, they were playing a dangerous game, and James was the target. But why? What had he missed all those years ago? The call made him realize that this wasn't just about the murders. It was about something much deeper. The killer wasn't just trying to get away with murder. They were trying to remind James of a mistake from his past, something he had long forgotten. For the next few days, James threw himself back into his old case files, going through everything again. The case had been complicated with so many twists and turns, but he had solved it. At least, that's what he had thought. He had believed the case was closed. But now, with the new murders, it felt like everything was falling apart again. "Maybe I missed something," James murmured to himself as he flipped through old photos and papers. He needed to find a clue, anything that could point to the killer's identity. But everything was pointing to the same dead end. The old case, the new murders, they were linked somehow, but he couldn't see how. James decided to take a break. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. The streets were calm, almost too calm. It was hard to believe that a killer was lurking nearby, watching him, waiting for the right moment. The thought made his stomach churn. He had been a detective for many years, but nothing had ever made him feel this uneasy. Just as he was about to turn back to his desk, the phone rang again. James hesitated before answering, unsure of who it could be this time. His heart raced as he picked up the receiver. "Detective James," the voice on the other end said, once again calm and steady. "Are you ready to remember, James? Ready to finally understand?" James gripped the phone, his knuckles white. "What do you want from me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Oh, I don't want anything," the voice replied. "I just want you to see the truth." All you need to do is think back. Think back to that night. James felt his heart skip a beat. The killer was referring to a specific night, a night that had been etched in his memory for years. It was the night that had changed everything. It was the night he had failed to catch the killer. "I don't want to hear it," James said, his voice shaking with frustration. "You're wasting my time." The voice laughed softly. "Am I? You think you've moved on, but you haven't. You've been running from the truth, hiding from it. But I'm still here, waiting." The line went silent. James slammed the phone down, his mind racing. The killer was trying to push him into a corner, forcing him to relive the past. But why? What was the connection between the old case and the new murders? As the days passed, James continued to dig into the past. He visited old places, met with people who had been involved in the case, and retraced his steps from that long-ago night. But every lead seemed to lead nowhere. It was like the killer had erased all traces of themselves from the world. Then, one evening, as James sat in his office, staring at the case files once again, he felt a strange sensation. It was as if someone was watching him. He turned slowly, but the room was empty. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his nerves getting the best of him. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. Just then, there was a knock on the door. James looked up, startled. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Come in," he called out. The door opened, and Officer Morgan stepped inside. She looked tired, her face pale and worried. She held a folder in her hands and walked over to James's desk. "I think you need to see this," she said, handing him the folder. James opened the folder and found a stack of new reports. It was about the latest murder, Peter Collins, the man who had been killed just a few days ago. But there was something new in the reports, something James hadn't seen before. There was a photo of the victim's home, taken from an angle that James hadn't noticed before. It showed the front door, but what caught his attention was the shadow. In the corner of the photo, just outside the door, there was a figure. It was barely visible, but it was there, standing still, watching. James stared at the photo for a long time. The figure in the shadows looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. His heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The killer wasn't just picking random victims. They were following a pattern that had something to do with James's past. "What is this?" Morgan asked, looking over his shoulder. James didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the figure in the photo. It was like a puzzle he was finally starting to solve, but the picture was still blurry. "I think I know who this is," James said quietly, more to himself than to Morgan. "But I need to be sure." Without saying another word, James grabbed his coat and walked out of the office. Morgan followed him, confused but determined to understand what was happening. James had a plan, but it was risky. He needed to visit someone from his past, a person he hadn't seen in years. As they drove through the city, James's mind raced. He knew that this person held the key to everything. If he was right, the killer's identity would finally be revealed. And with it, the truth about that night, the night he had failed. They arrived at an old, run-down house on the edge of town. The place looked abandoned, but James knew better. He had been here before, many years ago. The memories came flooding back, and for the first time in a long time he felt a sense of fear. The killer had been here too. James could feel it in his bones. James stepped out of the car, followed by Morgan. The door was locked, but James knew the way in. He walked around to the back of the house, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is where it all began," James said softly, as if speaking to himself. Morgan didn't ask any questions. She knew better than to interrupt James when he was this focused. They reached the back door, and James pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark and silent. The air smelled musty, as if it had been untouched for years. James stepped carefully into the living room, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. Suddenly, he stopped. There on the wall was a framed picture. It was an old photo, one that James had seen before. It was a photo of him, James, and a man he had once trusted. The man who had betrayed him. "That's him," James whispered. Morgan turned to him, confused. "Who?" "The killer," James said, his voice low. "It's always been him." Part 4. Unraveling the Truth. James stared at the picture on the wall, his mind racing. The man in the photo was someone he had known well, a former colleague, a friend even. He had trusted him, believed in him. But now, staring at the picture, everything about that old relationship felt like a lie. Morgan stood beside him, looking from James to the photo, clearly puzzled. "James, who is this? What are you talking about?" James turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This man, his name is Detective Harris. He was my partner many years ago. We worked together on some of the biggest cases. But there's something I missed, something I never saw before. He's the one behind all of this." Morgan was silent for a moment, trying to process what James was saying. "But how could you have missed it? If he was your partner, how could he be the killer?" James let out a deep sigh, running his hand through his hair. "That's the thing. I didn't miss it. I was blind to it. Harris was good at hiding his true nature. He was always the quiet one, always in the background, but always there. And I trusted him too much. I didn't see what was right in front of me." James turned back to the picture. The photo showed him and Harris, standing side by side, smiling after solving a particularly tricky case. They had been a great team back then. But now all he could see was a mask that Harris had worn to hide his true intentions. Morgan could see the pain in James's eyes. She knew how much this must have hurt him, to realize that someone he had trusted was the one behind the murders. "James, what do we do now? How do we stop him? James looked at her, determination slowly returning to his face. We need to find Harris. He's still out there, watching me, waiting. We can't let him get away with this. I should have caught him all those years ago. But now, I won't let him slip through my fingers again. Together, they left the house and got back into the car. James's mind was swirling with questions. How had Harris managed to stay hidden for so long? Why was he targeting James now? And most importantly, how could he have been so blind to the truth? As they drove, James couldn't help but replay the past in his mind. He remembered the day Harris had left the force. It had been sudden, with little explanation. Harris had said he needed a break, but James had always thought there was more to it. Now he realized the truth. Harris had been planning this for years. He had been watching James, waiting for the right moment to strike. James turned to Morgan, his voice low and urgent. We need to find out where Harris has been hiding. He must have a place, a safe house or something. If we can find it, we can catch him. Morgan nodded. I'll contact the department, see if anyone has heard from him. We need to track him down before he makes his next move. The drive seemed to take forever, but eventually, they arrived back at James's office. They wasted no time and immediately began their search. James pulled up Harris's old files, looking for anything that might give him a lead. It didn't take long for him to find something. In Harris's old case notes, there was a strange mention of a location, a small cabin in the woods, far from the city. It was a place James had never heard of before, but it looked suspicious. It seemed too quiet, too isolated. James felt a strange sense of unease. It was the perfect place for someone like Harris to hide. We found it, James said, his voice tense. This is where he's been. We need to go there, now. Morgan quickly grabbed her things, and they both headed for the car again. James's heart was pounding in his chest. He knew this was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when everything would come to an end. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. Harris couldn't slip away this time. The drive to the cabin took longer than James expected. The further they went, the more isolated the area became. The trees grew thicker, the roads narrower, and soon, they were driving down a dirt path that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, they arrived at a small clearing in the woods. The cabin stood there, old and weathered, surrounded by trees. It looked abandoned, but James wasn't fooled. He knew Harris had to be inside. We need to be careful, James whispered to Morgan. Harris is dangerous. He'll be expecting us. Morgan nodded, her expression serious. She had never seen James like this before. So focused, so determined. She knew he was thinking about the past, the mistakes he had made, and the trust he had lost. But she also knew that James was stronger than ever. He was ready to face whatever came next. They approached the cabin cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the cabin made James's heart race. He had been here before, in a way. This place felt familiar, like a piece of his past that he had left behind. As they reached the door, James motioned for Morgan to stay back. He slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open, his gun drawn. The door creaked loudly, echoing in the silent woods. Inside, the cabin was dark and quiet. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves outside. James stepped inside first, his senses alert. He scanned the room, looking for any sign of Harris. The cabin was small, with just a few pieces of old furniture. There was a fireplace in the corner, and a desk stacked with papers. But there was no sign of the man they were looking for. James's eyes narrowed. "He's here. I can feel it." Morgan stepped in after him, her hand on her own gun. Where could he be? James moved slowly, his footsteps echoing in the cabin. He walked over to the desk and picked up one of the papers. It was a map, marked with various locations. But there was something else on the map, a symbol, something that James recognized. "It's a code," James said, his voice low. "This is how he's been moving around. This map leads to different hideouts, different places where he's been." Suddenly, there was a noise from behind them. James whipped around, his gun raised. But it was too late. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Harris. James's heart stopped. Harris was standing there, a twisted smile on his face. "I've been waiting for you, James," Harris said, his voice cold and mocking. Part 5. The Confrontation. The air in the cabin grew heavy as James stood face to face with Harris. His old partner, his once trusted colleague, was now the very person he had been hunting. The man who had caused so many deaths, the one who had been watching him all along, was standing right in front of him. James couldn't believe his eyes. It felt like a nightmare, like he was trapped in a moment he couldn't escape. Harris's smile was wide, almost mocking. His eyes were cold, emotionless. "You look surprised, James," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "I thought you'd figured it out by now. You've always been sharp, but this time you were too slow." James felt his pulse quicken. He had known that Harris was dangerous, but seeing him now, standing there so confidently, made it all the more real. The years of trust, the partnership, the camaraderie, they had all been a lie. Harris wasn't just a killer. He had been playing a game that James hadn't even known he was part of. "You?" James struggled to find the right words. "Why, Harris? Why all of this? Why kill innocent people?" Harris's expression remained unchanged. "Innocent people? They were never innocent, James. You just didn't see it. They all had secrets, secrets they tried to hide. But I saw through them. I've always been able to see the truth. The real question is, why did you never see it in me?" James's mind raced. He had worked alongside Harris for years, trusted him like a brother. But now, the truth was crashing down on him. He had missed the signs. He had ignored the small details that didn't make sense. Harris had always been distant, always a little too quiet, but James had never questioned it. Now he understood why. Harris took a step forward, his eyes never leaving James. You were always the hero, James. The one who solved the cases, who got the glory. But you never saw me. You never saw what I really wanted. I was always in your shadow, always second place. And now, I'm finally in control. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always thought of Harris as a good person, as someone who shared his sense of justice. But now he realized how wrong he had been. Harris wasn't just trying to get revenge on those who had wronged him. He had been plotting this for years. He had been playing everyone, even James. You're insane, James muttered under his breath. Harris chuckled. Maybe, but maybe I'm the only one who truly understands the world. People like you, James, you just follow the rules. But I don't. I make my own rules. James took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't let fear take over now. He had to focus. He had to stop Harris before more people died. You've hurt enough people, Harris, James said firmly, his voice steady. It ends now. Harris's smile faded slightly, but his eyes still glinted with that cold, calculated look. It doesn't have to end, James. You could join me. You could help me finish what we started together. We were a great team, remember? James felt a rush of anger. You were never part of my team. You've been lying to me from the beginning. Harris took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. You think you know everything, don't you, James? You think you understand what's been happening. But you don't. You've been chasing shadows, trying to solve puzzles without knowing the whole picture. You're still just a pawn in my game. James's heart pounded in his chest. Harris wasn't just talking about the murders. He was talking about something bigger, something more dangerous. He had been manipulating everyone around him, pulling strings, and James had been too blind to see it. We're done, Harris, James said, his voice hardening. There's no going back for you. Harris's face twisted into a sneer. You think you can stop me? You think you've won? You're nothing but a washed-up detective who couldn't even solve the case that was right under his nose. For a brief moment, James felt a surge of doubt. What if Harris was right? What if he had missed something important, something that could turn the tide? But then he remembered why he had come out of retirement in the first place. He wasn't doing this for glory. He was doing this to stop a killer, to stop someone who had hurt innocent people, including his own friends. No, James said, shaking his head. It ends now. Harris's eyes flashed with anger. He took another step forward, his hands tightening into fists. You'll regret this, James. You'll regret thinking you can stop me. Suddenly, without warning, Harris lunged at James. It all happened so fast. James reacted instinctively, sidestepping just in time. Harris crashed into the wall, but he quickly regained his balance and turned to face James again, his eyes full of fury. "You're not getting away this time," James said, his voice low and determined. He knew this was it. There would be no more running, no more hiding. It was time to end this. James took a step back, keeping his distance from Harris. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Harris was dangerous, and he was unpredictable. But James had something Harris didn't experience. Harris charged again, but this time, James was ready. He dodged Harris's attack, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. Harris grunted in pain but quickly tried to free himself. James tightened his grip, pushing Harris down to the floor. For a moment, there was silence. James was on top of Harris, holding him down, his hands on Harris's wrists to keep him from moving. "This ends here," James said, his voice hard. But Harris wasn't finished. With one final surge of strength, he managed to flip James over, pinning him to the floor. Harris's face was inches from his, and James could see the crazed look in his eyes. It was a look James had never seen before, a look that was pure madness. "You'll never stop me, James," Harris hissed, his breath coming in quick bursts. James knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let Harris overpower him. With a burst of strength, he kicked Harris off of him and scrambled to his feet. Harris tried to get up, but James was quicker. He grabbed his gun, pointing it directly at Harris. "Stay down," James warned. Harris smirked. "You think this is over?" James's finger tightened on the trigger. He was done playing games. He wasn't going to let Harris escape this time. "This is over," James said, his voice steady and calm. Part 6. The Final Truth. James stood over Harris, his gun aimed steadily at the man who had once been his partner, his friend. The air in the small cabin was thick with tension, and every breath felt heavier than the last. James's hands trembled slightly, but he kept his eyes locked on Harris, not letting his guard down for a second. Harris lay on the floor, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. He was still smiling, though it was a grim and mocking smile. "You're a fool, James," he spat. "You really think you've won? You really think you can stop me?" James's heart was racing, but his voice was calm. "It's over, Harris. I'm not going to let you hurt anyone else." For a moment, there was only silence. Harris continued to glare at James, his eyes full of defiance. But there was a shift in the air. It was as if the weight of the truth had finally caught up with him. The lies, the manipulation, the killing. It had all been for nothing. Harris was trapped, and he knew it. "You've always been the good guy, haven't you?" Harris said, his voice cold. "The one who follows the rules. But you never understood me, James. You never understood what I was trying to do." James's grip on the gun tightened. "What were you trying to do, Harris? What could possibly justify all the murder and destruction?" Harris let out a bitter laugh, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of satisfaction. It was never about justice, James. It was about power, control. I wanted to show the world that I was in charge, that I was the one who could make things happen, not just sit back and watch others do it. James's mind reeled. All those years working with Harris, all the times they had solved cases together, had it all been part of some game to Harris? Had he been playing James from the very beginning? You never cared about justice, James said softly. You were just using people. Harris's smile faded, replaced by a look of bitterness. People are all the same, James. They all lie, cheat, and manipulate to get what they want. They think they're better than everyone else. But they're not. They're just pawns, just like you. James took a deep breath. He couldn't let Harris get to him. He had to stay focused. You're wrong, Harris. People can be good. They can change. Harris scoffed. Change? What change? Look at the world. Look at the people. They never change. They just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And I'm the one who sees through it all. I'm the one who understands how the world really works. James shook his head. No. You've lost yourself in your own lies. You're not seeing the truth. You're just hiding from it. For a long moment, Harris said nothing. His eyes were dark, and there was a look of deep pain in them now, as if the weight of everything he had done was finally catching up to him. But then, just as quickly, his anger returned. He sat up quickly, his eyes flashing with fury. You think you can stop me with a gun, James? You think you can end it all just like that? Harris's voice was sharp, but there was a sense of desperation behind it. I've been planning this for years. You're just a small part of the puzzle, James. I'm bigger than you. Bigger than all of them. James stepped back, his fingers still on the trigger. He couldn't let Harris manipulate him anymore. He had to end it, once and for all. You were never bigger than anyone, Harris. You were just a coward, James said firmly. And it's over. No more lives will be lost because of you. Harris's face twisted in fury, and for a moment, James thought he might try to attack again. But then, Harris stopped. His whole body seemed to sag, as if all the fight had gone out of him. His eyes shifted from anger to something else, something James couldn't quite place. It was like he had finally realized that there was no way out. He was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. Harris slowly lowered his head, staring at the floor. I didn't want it to end like this, he said softly, almost to himself. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be in control. James's grip on the gun loosened slightly, but he didn't lower it. He couldn't. Harris had hurt too many people. He couldn't just let him go. You can still choose to do the right thing, Harris, James said quietly. You can still turn yourself in. You can still face the consequences of what you've done. Harris didn't respond. He just sat there, looking broken. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of himself, was now defeated. James didn't know if he should feel sorry for him or angry. Harris had caused so much pain, so much death. And now, here he was, finally facing the truth. James could hear sirens in the distance. Backup was on the way. He didn't know if it was too late to save Harris, but he hoped that, at least, there would be some kind of justice. The world didn't have to be as cold and unforgiving as Harris had made it. There was still hope. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and James knew his time was running out. He needed to act quickly, but something inside him told him to wait. He had one last chance to make the right decision. "Harris," James said gently, lowering the gun slightly, "you don't have to die today. You can still make things right." Harris looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. For a moment, James saw a flicker of the man he had once known, the partner he had trusted. But it was fleeting. Harris had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The damage had been done. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin as the backup officers arrived. They quickly took control of the situation, handcuffing Harris and taking him away. James stood there, watching as Harris was led out of the cabin. It was over. The case that had haunted him for so long was finally closed. But James couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something left unfinished. He had stopped a killer, but the scars of the past would always remain. He watched the officers take Harris away, feeling a strange emptiness inside. The world was no longer the same, and neither was he. As he walked away from the cabin, James knew that the silence had been broken, but there would always be another killer, another mystery to solve. And he would be ready, just like he always had been. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.